My father slammed his fork down so hard the china rattled. The sound cut through the laughter and conversation like a gunshot. 40 relatives turned to stare as he pointed his finger directly at me, his face twisted with disgust. "You don't deserve to sit here," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the dining room. "You embarrassed this family." The words hung in the air, heavy and cruel. My face burned. My hands started to shake under the table. Every eye was on me now, watching, waiting for me to react. My father gestured toward the door like I was a servant being dismissed. "Stand up and leave this table. Now." The scrape of my chair against the hardwood floor was the only sound in the room. I stood slowly, keeping my back straight even though my legs felt like water. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't give him the satisfaction. I had learned years ago that reacting was exactly what he wanted. So I swallowed the humiliation, turned away from the table, and walked out of that dining room with my head held high. But inside, something had shifted. Something cold and final. The hallway felt like it stretched for miles. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out the muted whispers starting behind me. I could feel their eyes burning into my back, 40 sets of judgmental stares dissecting every step I took. My father's smirk was still burned into my mind. That satisfied, cruel expression that said he had won. He thought he had broken me in front of everyone. He thought public humiliation would finally teach me my place. I reached the bathroom and locked the door behind me, pressing my palms against the cool sink. My reflection stared back at me, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with unshed tears. But I wouldn't let them fall. Not here, not now. I took 3 deep breaths, counting each one slowly. This wasn't the first time my father had tried to destroy me. It was just the first time he had done it in front of an audience this large. What did he think he'd just won? I straightened my shoulders and smoothed down my dress. I would go back out there. I would smile politely, and I would remember every single face that stayed silent while he humiliated me. When I emerged from the bathroom, my Aunt Margaret was waiting in the hallway, wringing her hands nervously. She glanced toward the dining room, then back at me with worried eyes. "Elspeth, dear," she whispered, reaching for my arm. "Don't make a scene, please. Your father is just stressed about work. You know how he gets." I stared at her. Stressed about work? What was the excuse? He had just publicly expelled me from a family dinner like I was trash, and her first instinct was to protect him. To make sure I stayed quiet and didn't embarrass him further by defending myself. She squeezed my arm gently. "Just apologize, sweetheart. Tell him you're sorry. It will all blow over." The words made my stomach turn. Apologize for what? For existing? For breathing the same air as him? I pulled my arm away from her grip, keeping my voice steady and low. "I'm not making a scene, Aunt Margaret," I said quietly. "He already did that." Her face flushed and she looked away, uncomfortable. The family protects the loudest bully. That's how it has always worked. So who protects me? Nobody, I realized. Nobody ever had. I walked back into that dining room with my spine straight and my face calm. The conversations had resumed, but they were quieter now, more careful. People avoided my eyes as I moved past them toward the coat closet. My father sat at the head of the table, holding court like a king, laughing too loudly at someone's joke. He didn't even glance in my direction. I was already erased. My younger cousin Emma caught my eye from across the room. She looked horrified, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. She didn't say anything. Nobody did. I grabbed my purse and jacket from the closet, moving slowly, deliberately. I wasn't running away. I was choosing to leave. There's a difference. As I reached the front door, I heard my father's voice boom across the room. "That's right, Elspeth. Run away like you always do." Laughter followed. Nervous, uncomfortable laughter, but laughter nonetheless. I paused with my hand on the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to shout back, to defend myself. But I didn't. Instead, I opened the door and stepped out into the cool evening air. At the reunion, my father rebuked me from the table. So I planned my exit slowly, carefully, and completely. "My name is Elspeth Ward, and I am 34 years old. I didn't always know that silence could be a weapon. For most of my life, I thought it was just survival. Growing up, my father ruled our house with public shame and private coldness. He was a successful consultant, the kind of man who commanded attention in every room he entered. People respected him. They listened when he spoke. And he knew it. I was his eldest daughter, the one who was supposed to make him proud. But nothing I did was ever enough. Straight A's in school. He'd ask why I wasn't valedictorian. Graduated college with honors. He'd mention my cousin who went to Harvard. Got promoted at work. He'd suggest I was lucky, not skilled. My mother had died when I was 12, leaving me to navigate his moods alone. My younger sister, Rebecca, had learned early to stay invisible, to never challenge him. But I had always been the one who asked questions, who pushed back just a little. And for that, I paid. The humiliation didn't start at that reunion dinner. It had been building for years, layered on top of itself until I couldn't see straight anymore. But that night made it public, and somehow that changed everything. 3 years before that dinner, I had made a terrible mistake. I married Daniel Crawford. He was polite, successful, and safe. My father approved of him, which should have been my first warning sign. Daniel worked in finance, wore expensive suits, and said all the right things at family gatherings, but behind closed doors he was hollow. Our marriage was like living with a ghost. He wasn't cruel, not like my father. He was just absent. He would come home late, sit on the couch with his phone, and respond to my questions with one-word answers. I cooked dinners he barely touched. I planned vacations he canceled. I tried to talk about my day, and his eyes would glaze over before I finished a sentence. I kept everyone comfortable except myself. I told myself it was normal, that all marriages go through phases. But at night, I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, feeling myself shrink smaller and smaller. I was disappearing into his indifference. And the worst part? Nobody noticed. My father thought Daniel was perfect. My friends said I was lucky to have such a stable husband. So I smiled and nodded and pretended everything was fine while I slowly suffocated in that quiet, empty house. I worked at Hartwell Industries, a mid-sized corporate compliance firm downtown. It was the kind of workplace with glass walls and open floor plans that were supposed to promote transparency, but really just meant everyone could see you struggling. I was good at my job, really good. I caught inconsistencies others missed. I flagged potential violations before they became disasters. I wrote reports that saved the company millions in fines. But when promotion time came, the credit went to my manager, Greg. When I presented ideas in meetings, they were ignored until a male colleague repeated them 5 minutes later. It was killed by 1,000 paper cuts. I started documenting everything. I kept meticulous records of my work, saving emails with timestamps, keeping copies of reports before they were edited. I didn't know why I was doing it at first. It just felt necessary, like building a wall brick by brick without knowing what I was protecting myself from. My coworkers thought I was paranoid. Greg called me detail-oriented in a tone that made it sound like an insult. But I kept filing, kept saving, kept building my evidence folder. Because somewhere deep down, I knew I would need it. The night of the reunion dinner, after I left my father's house, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed replaying the scene over and over like a video stuck on repeat. The fork hitting the plate, his pointing finger, the silence. But as I replayed it, something new caught my attention. Right before he humiliated me, my father had been talking to his golf buddy Richard about a business deal. He had mentioned something about streamlining operations at a manufacturing company, using phrases like redundancy elimination and restructuring timeline. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. My father was always talking about business. But now, lying in the dark, those phrases echoed in my mind. I had heard them before, recently, at work. We had just completed a confidential audit for a manufacturing client about potential restructuring. The report wasn't public. It hadn't even been finalized yet. Only a handful of people had access to it. So how did my father know those exact terms? How did he know about timeline specifics that hadn't been announced? I sat up in bed, my heart suddenly racing. My father mentioned a deal he shouldn't know about. Coincidence? Or had someone been feeding him information? Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention. Not to what my father said to me, but to what he said to everyone else. At a small family birthday party, I sat quietly in the corner while he held court with his business associates. He mentioned a tech merger that sounded remarkably similar to a case our firm was consulting on. He dropped terms like due diligence phase and equity restructuring, language I'd used in internal reports. Then, at a charity event, I overheard him advising someone about avoiding compliance issues using strategies that mirrored a presentation I'd given just 2 weeks earlier. A pattern was emerging. My father's consulting advice wasn't just good. It was oddly specific, too specific. It used corporate language that matched confidential documents from my workplace almost word for word. Each conversation felt like a puzzle piece clicking into place. He was getting information from somewhere inside Hartwell Industries, and whoever was feeding it to him was either careless or arrogant enough to think nobody would notice. I started keeping notes. Dates, phrases, connections. I didn't know what I was building toward yet, but I knew I needed evidence. Men who brag always over-explain, and my father had been bragging for years. I didn't confront him. I didn't march into his office and demand answers. That's what he would expect. That's what would give him ammunition to call me hysterical, paranoid, attention-seeking. Instead, I became a ghost at family events. I smiled politely. I asked bland questions. I listened. My father never suspected that his dismissed, embarrassed daughter was now documenting every word he said. He thought I was still small, still broken from the dinner incident. He saw me the way he had always seen me, as someone beneath his concern. That was his mistake. I started connecting dots between his conversations and my work cases. A comment about pharmaceutical regulations appeared 2 days after I'd submitted a report on that exact topic. A knowing laugh about real estate loopholes came right after I'd flagged potential violations in a property deal. He wasn't just getting general industry information. He was getting my work. Someone was accessing my reports and feeding them directly to him. But who? I reviewed access logs at work, cross-referenced names with family connections. My father knew a lot of people and had his fingers in many pies. Finding the leak would take time, but I had learned patience. Silence had become my strategy, and in the quiet, I was building something dangerous. 6 months after the reunion dinner, I did something I should have done years ago. I left Daniel. It wasn't dramatic. There was no screaming match, no thrown dishes. I simply told him I wanted a divorce, and he looked up from his phone, shrugged, and said, "If that's what you want." That was it. 3 years of marriage ended with a shrug. We divided our assets cleanly through lawyers. He got the downtown condo. I got my freedom. My father, predictably, was furious. He called me selfish, impulsive, throwing away a good man. But his anger felt hollow now, like background noise I'd learned to tune out. For the first time in years, I lived alone. A small apartment with big windows that let in afternoon light. No one to cook for. No one to wait for. No one's mood to manage. Just me and the quiet. And in that quiet, I could finally think clearly. The divorce stripped away the last layer of performance. I wasn't trying to be a good wife anymore. I wasn't trying to be a dutiful daughter. I was just Elspeth, finally with room to breathe. I finally had room to think. And what I was thinking about was how to expose the leak at work without exposing myself. Back at Hartwell Industries, I got access to something useful. Our firm had upgraded our internal security system, which meant new audit trails for document access. I spent lunch breaks reviewing logs, tracking who opened which files and when. Most access patterns made sense. Team members working on cases, managers reviewing reports. But then I noticed something strange. Someone had accessed 3 of my confidential reports within hours of my father making oddly specific comments at family events. The login belonged to Derek Marshall, a senior analyst in corporate strategy. I didn't know Derek well. He was quiet, efficient, kept to himself. But when I dug deeper, I found the connection. Derek's sister was married to Richard, my father's golf buddy. The same Richard who had been at the reunion dinner when my father humiliated me. The same Richard my father had been advising using my confidential work. The pieces clicked together. Derek was accessing my reports and passing information to Richard, who shared it with my father. My father used it to boost his consulting reputation, looking brilliant with insider knowledge. It was insider trading without stocks. My father's voice echoed in a spreadsheet, in phrases I'd written, in strategies I'd developed. And Derek thought he was safely hidden behind corporate access protocols. He was wrong. 2 weeks later, my father called me. His voice had that patronizing edge I knew so well, the tone that said he was about to ask for something while making it sound like he was doing me a favor. "Elspeth," he said, "I have a client interested in manufacturing compliance issues. You work in that area, don't you?" I kept my voice neutral. "I work in corporate compliance generally." "Why?" He laughed, that booming sound that used to make me flinch. "I'm just saying, if you happen to hear anything interesting about manufacturing audits, I'd love to pick your brain. Maybe over dinner. You could make up for that embarrassing scene at the reunion." There it was, the manipulation wrapped in fake kindness. He wanted information directly from me now. He probably sensed that his pipeline through Derek was drying up, though he didn't know why. I could have confronted him right then. could have called him out on his unethical fishing expedition. But I didn't. Instead, I said pleasantly, "I don't think that would be appropriate, Dad. Company confidentiality and all." He made a dismissive sound. "You always were too rigid, Elspeth. It's just a conversation." I smiled even though he couldn't see me. "I'll keep that in mind." After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone. He still thinks I'm small. He has no idea what's coming. 3 months later, I got promoted, senior compliance officer. It was a position I'd earned through documented, meticulous work, years of catching problems before they exploded. But it also came with something more valuable: expanded access. I could now see cross-departmental files, audit trails, financial records that had been above my clearance level before. My new supervisor, Janet Price, was sharp and no-nonsense. During my first week, she pulled me aside. "I've been reviewing some irregular access patterns," she said, tapping her tablet. "Multiple confidential reports opened outside business hours by someone without case assignment." I kept my face carefully neutral. "Have you identified who?" She nodded slowly. "Derek Marshall. But I want to understand the pattern before I act." "You're good with patterns, Elspeth. Help me build the timeline." It was the opening I'd been waiting for. I showed her my notes, carefully framed as observations I'd made while securing my own work. We mapped Derek's access against external events, business deals, consulting contracts. The pattern was damning. Janet's expression grew harder with each connection. When we finished, she looked at me with something like respect. "This is corporate espionage," she said quietly. "Small scale, but espionage nonetheless." I met her eyes. "What happens now?" She closed her tablet. "Now we document everything and file a formal report. Internally first, then externally if needed." I finally had the visibility I needed, and a bigger view of how deep the corruption went. My father called again 2 weeks later. There was another family gathering, a cousin's engagement party, and he wanted to make sure I'd be there. His tone was lighter than usual, almost friendly. "I think we should put that reunion incident behind us," he said smoothly. "Water under the bridge. Family is family, right?" I agreed to come, curious about his sudden change in tone. When I arrived at the country club, my father greeted me with an actual smile. He pulled me aside early in the evening, away from the crowd. "I may have been too harsh at the reunion," he said, the words clearly painful for him. "You know how I get when I'm stressed. Let's move forward." It wasn't an apology. It was a non-apology wrapped in excuses and tied with expectations of my forgiveness. But what struck me was the nervousness underneath his words, the way his eyes shifted, the forced casualness. He was worried about something. "Why, what has changed?" I smiled and accepted his fake olive branch. "Of course, Dad, family is family," but I watched him carefully for the rest of the evening. He was distracted, checking his phone constantly. He cut conversations short. And when Richard arrived, they disappeared into a private corner for 20 minutes, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. Something had spooked him, and I was pretty sure I knew what. The investigation at work was starting to send ripples outward. He could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet, even if he didn't know why yet. That night, I laid everything out on my dining room table. Documents, access logs, timelines, recorded statements from family gatherings. I had been collecting pieces for months without fully understanding what picture they would create. Now I could see it clearly. Derek Marshall accessed my confidential reports. He passed information to his brother-in-law Richard. Richard shared it with my father, who used it to enhance his consulting practice. My father gave advice that made him look brilliant because he had insider knowledge from ongoing corporate investigations. It was a daisy chain of unethical information sharing, small enough to stay under the radar, smart enough to seem coincidental, but documented carefully enough to prove deliberate intent. The long game clicked into place. I didn't need revenge. Revenge was emotional, messy, unreliable. What I needed was timing. I needed to let the system do exactly what it was designed to do: catch corruption, investigate misconduct, enforce consequences. All I had to do was provide the evidence and step back. My father had built his reputation on stolen knowledge. He had humiliated me publicly to maintain his dominance. But he had made one critical error. He had dismissed me so completely that he never considered I might be watching, might be documenting, might be preparing. The next morning, I walked into Janet's office with an expanded file. I had spent the weekend organizing everything into a clear, professional report. Facts only. No personal grudges, no family drama, just data, timelines, and evidence of unauthorized information disclosure. Janet read through it carefully, her expression growing more serious with each page. "This goes beyond Derek," she said finally. "If your analysis is correct, this information chain extends outside the company and potentially impacts our client relationships." I nodded. "The consulting advice being given is based on our confidential work. It could be considered corporate espionage depending on how the information was used." She closed the file. "I need to bring this to the executive team and our legal department. Are you prepared for that? This will trigger a formal investigation. It might get uncomfortable." I met her eyes steadily. "I understand." She studied me for a long moment. "Your father's name is in this report." "Yes," I said quietly, "I'm aware." Janet nodded slowly, something like respect in her expression. "All right, I'll file this today. Let the system do its job." I left her office feeling strangely calm. I had just set in motion an investigation that would likely destroy my father's reputation. But I hadn't done it out of spite. I had done it because it was right. Because corruption should have consequences. And because I was done protecting people who had never protected me. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Within 2 weeks, the company had launched a formal internal audit. Derek was placed on administrative leave. His access was revoked, his files seized. Whispers rippled through the office like wildfire. People love scandal, even corporate scandal. They gathered in break rooms, speculating about what had happened and why. I kept my head down and my mouth shut. I answered questions from the investigation team calmly and professionally. Yes, I had noticed irregular access patterns. Yes, I had documented concerns. No, I had no personal vendetta, just professional due diligence. But outside of work, the pressure was building. My father started calling more frequently. At first, the calls were casual, fishing for information about what's going on at your company. Then they became more urgent, more demanding. "Have you heard anything about corporate investigations? Is anyone asking about consultants?" "What exactly did you tell them?" I gave him nothing. Just vague responses about not being involved in executive decisions, about confidentiality protocols. His frustration was palpable. Fear makes bullies reckless, and my father was getting reckless. He called family members looking for information. He pressed mutual connections. He demanded meetings with people at my company. Each desperate action just made him look more suspicious, more guilty. All I had to do was wait. 3 weeks after the investigation started, there was another family gathering. My grandmother's birthday celebration. I debated not going, but curiosity won. I wanted to see how my father handled being in the hot seat for once. He arrived late, dressed impeccably as always, but there was something off. His smile was too wide. His laugh was too loud. He immediately launched into stories about his recent consulting successes, name-dropping clients and deals. But I noticed something I'd never seen before. People were uncomfortable. They shifted in their seats. They glanced at each other. They changed subjects quickly. My Uncle Thomas, who usually hung on my father's every word, excused himself after just 5 minutes of conversation. Aunt Margaret, who had told me not to make a scene at the reunion, now avoided sitting near him. The whole family could feel something coming. They didn't know what exactly, but the air was thick with unspoken tension. My father noticed too. His boasts became more defensive, more aggressive. He practically cornered people, demanding their attention and validation. It was desperate. It was uncomfortable. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one everyone pitied. I sat quietly in the corner, watching the dynamics shift. The power was redistributing right before my eyes, and my father was on the wrong side of it now. The audit team called me in for a formal interview. It was scheduled, professional, and recorded. They asked about my work process, about document security, about my observations regarding unusual access patterns. I answered every question calmly. I had my receipts ready, time-stamped emails, saved reports, access logs I'd been monitoring for months. My voice stayed steady throughout the 2-hour interview. When they asked if I had noticed any external parties benefiting from internal information, I mentioned observing my father using oddly specific terminology at family events. I provided dates, contexts, and witnesses who had been present. Was it uncomfortable nomming my own father in a corporate investigation? Yes. Was it necessary? Absolutely. The investigators took careful notes. They asked follow-up questions. They requested copies of my documentation, which I provided on an organized flash drive. At the end of the interview, the lead investigator thanked me for my thoroughness and professionalism. This is what preparation feels like. It feels like walking into a room knowing you have done everything right, that you followed the rules, kept the records, told the truth. There's no anxiety in that, no guilt, just the quiet confidence of someone who built their case carefully and is now presenting it clearly. I walked out of that conference room, feeling lighter than I had in years. The dominoes fell quickly after that. The internal audit expanded into an external investigation involving the State Business Ethics Board. Derek Marshall was terminated for violating confidentiality agreements and company policy. He tried to fight it, but the evidence was overwhelming. Then the investigation widened to include the people Derek had shared information with. Richard was questioned about his consulting practices and his relationship with my father. Email records revealed months of suspicious communications. My father's consulting firm was subpoenaed. His client contracts were reviewed. His advice was analyzed against confidential reports from multiple companies, not just mine. The pattern was undeniable. He had built his reputation on information he shouldn't have had, on knowledge that was stolen, filtered through family connections, and repackaged as expertise. 3 of his major clients dropped him within a week of the news breaking. His professional reputation collapsed like a house of cards. No criminal charges were filed. The district attorney determined the information sharing, while unethical, didn't quite meet the threshold for prosecution, but the professional consequences were devastating. He lost contracts, lost reputation, lost the respect he had spent decades building. And the beautiful part? He built this trap himself. Every boast, every careless mention of confidential details, every arrogant assumption that he was untouchable. I had just documented it. The phone calls from family members started coming, but this time they weren't calling my father. They were calling me. My cousin Emma called first, apologizing for not speaking up at the reunion dinner. I should have said something, she said quietly. What he did to you was wrong. Then Aunt Margaret called, her voice shaky. She didn't apologize exactly, but she asked how I was doing if I needed anything. Even Uncle Thomas reached out, suggesting coffee to catch up. The family dynamic had completely inverted. The man who had ruled through intimidation and public shame was now the one being whispered about. People asked me questions carefully, respectfully. They wanted to know what had happened, how I was handling it. I kept my answers brief and kind. I didn't gloat. I didn't trash my father with relatives. I just said that the truth had a way of coming out and that professional ethics matter. But the shift was undeniable. For 34 years, I had been the disappointing daughter, the one who never quite measured up. Now I was the one people called for advice, for support, for honest conversation. The table had turned completely, and I hadn't had to burn any bridges or destroy any relationships to make it happen. I had simply told the truth and let the consequences unfold naturally. My father tried to call me exactly twice after everything fell apart. The first time I didn't answer. He left a voicemail that was equal parts angry and desperate. This is your fault, Elspeth. You destroyed my career over a personal grudge. You're vindictive and petty, just like I always said. I deleted it without listening to the whole thing. The second call came 3 weeks later. This time his voice was different, smaller. He asked if we could meet, if we could talk about what happened. He said things had gotten out of hand, that he hadn't meant for any of this. There was no apology, just excuses and self-pity. I didn't call him back. The professional consequences for my father were total. His consulting firm closed. His reputation in business circles was destroyed. He had to sell his house, downsize his life, reckon with the reality that his success had been built on borrowed knowledge and unearned expertise. But there were no criminal charges, no jail time. No public scandal beyond professional circles, just the quiet, complete collapse of everything he had built on lies. Some people might say I destroyed my father, but that's not accurate. He destroyed himself through arrogance, through theft, through the assumption that he could take whatever he wanted without consequences. I just documented it. I just told the truth. And sometimes that's enough. 6 months after the investigation concluded, I changed my phone number. I moved to a different apartment in a neighborhood my family didn't know. I declined interview requests from former colleagues curious about the scandal. I simply moved forward. At work, I was respected. My promotion stuck. My judgment was trusted. I had proven that I could handle difficult situations with professionalism and integrity. In my personal life, I started building something new. Real friendships based on honesty rather than obligation. Hobbies I actually enjoyed rather than ones that looked good. Therapy sessions that helped me understand the patterns I'd survived. I wasn't trying to rebuild a relationship with my father. I wasn't waiting for the apology that would never come. I was just living my life on my own terms for the first time ever. Peace isn't dramatic. It doesn't come with fanfare or victory laps. It's a quiet morning with good coffee. It's work you're proud of. It's a relationship where you don't have to perform. It's going to sleep at night without replaying humiliations or planning defenses. For 34 years, I had been fighting for a seat at a table that didn't value me. Now I had my own table, my own space, my own peace, and that was the real victory. The next family reunion came around a year later. I received the invitation in the mail, forwarded to my new address by a well-meaning cousin. I looked at it for a long time. Part of me was curious. Part of me wanted to walk in there vindicated, successful, whole. But the bigger part of me recognized that I didn't need that anymore. I didn't need to prove anything to people who had watched me be humiliated and said nothing. I didn't need closure from a father who still didn't understand what he'd done wrong. I didn't need a seat at that table, so I didn't go. And according to Emma, who texted me later, neither did my father. His chair sat empty at the head of the table. People whispered about his absence. Some felt sorry for him. Some said he deserved it. Most just felt uncomfortable. The reunion continued without either of us, and apparently it was fine. The family moved on. They always do. But I moved on differently. I moved on toward something rather than away from something. Toward peace, toward authenticity, toward a life where I didn't have to shrink myself to fit someone else's expectations. I moved on knowing my worth, finally, completely. And knowing that I would never beg for a seat at anyone's table again, not when I could build my own. What would you do in this situation? Would you have exposed the corruption even though it meant your father's career would collapse? Or would you have stayed silent to keep the peace? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. I read every single one. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt underestimated or dismissed by people who should have valued you, hit that like button and subscribe. These stories matter because they remind us that truth and patience are more powerful than retaliation. And sometimes, the best revenge is just living well and letting the consequences unfold naturally. Remember, knowing your worth means never begging for a seat again.